Hi people, welcome to another video of Color, and I'm just going to be finishing where I stopped last time, and yeah, let's just get to it.
Has survived. There is 3 great volumes of ancient Egyptian literature published by a scholar called Mary Lichtenheim. I suggest you look them up, in addition to the coffin texts and the pyramid texts and others. Next slide, please. This is Imhotep. Has anyone seen the film The Mummy Returns? Can you see that this real Imhotep doesn't look much like the Imhotep in The Mummy Returns? And he is quite arguably the first polymath, the first multi-genius recorded in human history. The same 2 American physicists I mentioned earlier, Thomas Bouval and Robert Brophy, or Robert Bouval. Brophy, I always get their names confused. They wrote a book on Imhotep's work. But he designed the oldest pyramids still standing in Egypt, the oldest medical books in human history. He wrote, of course, someone may have wrote medical books before him, but the oldest surviving we have. So we could properly call him the father of medicine. We currently call Hippocrates the father of medicine, but Hippocrates was born 2,000 years later. Next slide, please.
Oh, and fun fact, did you know that Africans invented vaccines? Or if you didn't know that, now you know that.
But I don't want to give you the impression, as some people try to, that ancient Egypt was all that happened in Africa. And even some, people considered Afrocentric can overstate the case and act like ancient Egyptian civilization, impressive as it was the only civilization that occurred in Africa. It wasn't even the oldest kingdom in Africa. The oldest kingdom in Africa would be in what today, that we know of, would be in what today is Sudan, a place called Kutsul. They call it the land of the bow. About 2 to 3 centuries before the rise of ancient Egypt. Just as you can see, it concurs with what the ancient Greeks said about ancient Egyptian civilization coming from inner Africa, concurs with many other forms of evidence. At a place called Kutsul, there was the first kingdom, recognized kingdom in Africa, and it had many of the symbols that would later go into pharaonic Egypt. So it was in many ways a precursor to pharaonic Egypt. But there have been many stages of civilization in Sudan that started before and proceeded to after the fall of formal pharaonic civilization. So if we fast forward a little bit, next slide please, and again, we see pyramids like this. I've been here. There are more pyramids surviving in Sudan than there are in Egypt, 223 in all, though they are not as old as the ones in ancient Egypt. These are of a later date. These ones are from about 100 BC. Next slide please. Then if we go forward, there was a Christian empire in Sudan. This is a reconstruction by a Polish archaeologist of a Christian church from 1000 AD rather. Yeah, again, pretty impressive. Based on the remains, this is what it would have looked like. Next slide, please. Fast forward to Ethiopia. Now this, I always show people this and I usually ask, what is unusual about this building? But we haven't got time for the quiz. It usually takes people a little while to figure it out. But it's not technically a building. It's a carving. The architect and the builders of this 800-year-old church have dug down into the ground and carved the building out of the mountain. Next slide, please. And that's what it looks like inside. Can you see that's quite impressive for 800 years ago? Quite beautiful. Next slide, please. This is a stele, weighs 450 family-sized cars, the equivalent of 300 tons. We don't actually know how 2,000 years ago, people in Ethiopia managed A, to carve this block of granite, and B, to get it to stand up without a crane. And can you see, if you look closely, it's imitating a multi-story building. I can't say that they had multi-story buildings, but there's a door at the bottom, and there's what are clearly floors and the imitation of windows going up to the top. Nonetheless, it's fairly impressive to get a 300-ton block of granite to stand up without a crane. And it isn't even the largest stele found in Ethiopia in this time. The largest one found weighs 500 tons, so almost double, but it's no longer standing. Next slide, please. Now, if I showed you these castles at the beginning of this presentation, and we didn't know this was a presentation on African history, we'd probably assume these were in England or Scotland or Norway, but these are Ethiopian castles from the 17th century. Next slide, please. We get to Western Central Africa. This is the heart of where Africans were supposed to display their innate inferiority, because this is where most of the enslaved Africans enslaved in the Americas were taken from. And what do we have here? In 1668, a Dutchman called Olfert de Poor traveled around Central and Western Africa, and he drew some pictures. This is a picture from what today would be Nigeria, the Kingdom of Benin. In 1668, you can see the procession of the king. You can see multi-story buildings in the background. If you look really closely, even though it's quite small for some of you at the back, you can see the city in the...
I mean, African kingdoms and just Africa itself, we were just an amazing continent with everything going just right. We were rich They were not thieves or anything else. But then the white people came and everything went downhill.
The background, it has a wall around the outside of it. This wall, the Great Wall of Benin, is in the Guinness Book of World Records, 1974 edition, as the largest earthworks carried out prior to the mechanical era. It's estimated that the wall at its height may have been as much as 10,000 miles of walling. I didn't start or make a mistake. Go and take up the beef with the archaeologists. Next slide, please. This is the city of Luango in the Kingdom of Congo. Same year, drawn by the same guy. We can see clear evidence of urban planning, straight streets, terrace housing, multi-story buildings, again a wall around the entire outer city with gates in it. This particular state was almost like a sort of early client state of the Portuguese. For 2 centuries they'd already been trading at this point ivory and pepper with the Portuguese, and this empire had an embassy in Rome during this period. Not something we learn about or talk about too tough. Next slide, please. This is the city of Agades in the Empire of Songhai, which would be in the country Niger today. This city at its height, this is again drawn by a European traveller called Dr. Henry David Bath, had 70,000 people living there in the 16th century. 20,000 to 30,000 people lived in London in the 16th century. So that gives you a sense of how quickly history can evolve. London was the largest city in the world 150 years ago in terms of population. It isn't even close to that today. So that gives you a sense of how quickly a major metropolis can become not the big metropolis anymore, and how a Western African city can have been bigger than London, and of course not be the case just a few centuries later. It wasn't the largest city in Western Africa at the time. The largest empire in Western Africa, or there were 4 concentric empires rather. The Empire of Ghana, which today would be in the country Mauritania, but is where the country Ghana takes its name. Then Mali, which the Empire of Mali at its height spread all the way from Senegal deep into Mauritania, 1,500 miles across, probably the most wealthy empire in African history other than ancient Egypt. And according to even mainstream scholars like Felipe Fernandez Armesto, the richest state in the 14th century world. This is one mosque/university from that empire. This particular one is the Grand Mosque of Djenné. Has anyone ever heard of a place called Timbuktu? Now, did anyone else think Timbuktu was a made-up place when they first heard of Timbuktu? I know when I was young, I thought Timbuktu was a made-up place. Turns out Timbuktu was a real place, and there's a university still standing in Timbuktu in the ancient Malian Empire, but there's a good reason why we think of Timbuktu as being magical, as we're going to come to a little bit later. In the Malian kingdom, there are still 750,000 handwritten manuscripts surviving. 750,000 to this day, containing all kinds of information. Now, one of them was brought to the attention of the world by Michael Palin in a BBC program called Sahara. And he basically says, I'll paraphrase here, but he says this document, which is from the Kingdom of Mali at the time, clearly shows the phases of the moon. The problem with it is that it's 150 to 200 years older than the birth of Galileo and Copernicus. So it makes us think about the entire history of science in an interesting way. Again, that's not me saying that, that's Michael Palin saying that. If you've got beef, take it up with Michael Palin. Next slide, please. South and Eastern Africa. This is what they call Great Zimbabwe, one of over 100 stone courts across southern Africa. Let's go on to the next slide. I've been here. I thought it was a bit narcissistic to include my holiday photos, so I didn't. But no, go back, please. But this outer wall is 100,000 tons of granite bricks held together without any cement. It was built in the year 1335 AD by the Shona people of Zimbabwe. Again, I have to emphasize that most of the kingdoms I'm showing you, at some point or other, some scholar somewhere argued they were not built by Africans, and this was no exception. For a long time, people were like, could have been anyone, the Chinese, Arabs, Lebanese people, Europeans, aliens.
First of all, the Chinese were not even in Africa, but by that time, like, you said the Chinese. Wow.
Aliens, anyone but Africans. Eventually they gave up, and they was like, all right, yeah, the Shona probably built it. The most likely explanation is that the people that live there maybe built it. Next slide, please. This is a door. Now, can you see, if your front door looks like this today, life's all right for you. You're probably doing quite well. You're probably quite wealthy. This is a 700-year-old East African door from Zanzibar, from what we call the Swahili Confederacy. So there was a collection of city-states almost that spoke the language Kiswahili in East Africa, that were part of a semi-global trade network. They traded with the Middle East, with India, far afield as China and the Javanese Empire. There's a fantastic book by a woman called Janet Abu Loghold called Before European Hegemony, and it looks at the semi-global system of trade between East Africa, the Middle East, India, and China at the time. And the wealth of this kingdom was part of the product of that semi-global trade system. Next slide, please. This is a house from the period. Now, can you see that other than the mold around the door, that could be a 1920s Art Deco house? And according to English Africanist scholar Basil Davidson, who's been there, I haven't been there, but this is what the writing here says of him investigating that. These houses, of course the houses of rich people living in this time, contain good internal sanitation. Next slide, please. This is a reconstruction of one of the main palaces from 1300 AD in what today would be Tanzania. Can you see the swimming pool? There was 100 rooms in here. Yeah, 1300 AD palace in Eastern Africa. Next slide, please. And then we get onto the image of black people in early Europe, which is something that's contentious because we are almost taught, even if subtly, if you watch, as I do for my sins, if you watch a TV show like Game of Thrones, even though you know it's not real history, it's still going in. And you watch Game of Thrones, and the only time black people pop up in this narrative that's supposed to sort of loosely be the human story, again, is as slaves. That isn't an accident. The casting director decided we're going to have black people and they're going to play the slaves. And, we'll get some brown people, Middle Eastern people, and they'll play Dothraki savages that eat hearts. Someone asked for that to be the case, and that's how that happens. So if you're a young person growing up and you imagine a medieval world, you don't imagine people of African descent necessarily having participated. How do I know this? When I teach Shakespeare at schools, which I often do, and I read a passage from Othello, or I read sonnets 127 to 142, where Shakespeare clearly refers to someone who's black, but everyone's avoiding that, right? Children have actually said to me, but sir, were there black people in Shakespeare's time? And I don't realize what they're saying. People in this country, in an advanced, developed, wealthy country, because they don't realize that they don't conceive even of Africans having ever existed at that time in many ways. But let's see what was actually going on in Europe. It's a gentleman called Saint Maurice. Saint Maurice was part of the Theban Egyptian legions of the Roman army. He became a saint in Christendom. These are carvings of Saint Maurice, or paintings of Saint Maurice rather, from 16th century Germany. Next slide. Again, next slide. Different saint. Saint Elesban, who was said to be an ancient Ethiopian king that had fought against Jewish people on behalf of Christendom. This particular picture of him is from Portugal, from the 1750s. Next slide. This is the giant, I don't know how to pronounce that word, but I presume it's Yasur. This is from France, and this is commemorating the battle with William of Orange in the 13th century. And this is still there in the town in France where it was painted. Again, it gives us food for thought. Next slide. But this is where it gets slightly controversial and problematic. We have these images, over 100 of them, across Europe, of Madonna and Jesus depicted. Well, it speaks for itself, really, doesn't it?
That's right, people.
Now, the shame of history is this. There's a fantastic blog online called Medieval POC, which deals with the role of people of color in the medieval world. You should all follow them. They're enlightening. I've learned so much from their blog. They're on Twitter and they're on Tumblr. But one of the things they pointed out to me, I can't remember which one of these Madonnas it was, but there's one that's in Poland, a really famous one. And it was restored a couple of years ago. What do you think they did during the restoration?
What did they
painted it
do?
white. So can you see how you can be robbed of history and not even know?
Wow.
Noses come off, black Madonnas go white, and no one explains why.
Exactly.
Now, if you put into an internet search engine, Isis and Horus, you might have some idea where the inspiration for this statue came from. I'll leave it at that, because that's another lecture for another day. Next slide, please. This is a European map from 1413 AD. The two gentlemen in the map, the gentleman on the left is Mansa Musa, king of the Malian Empire at its height. He is estimated by many economists today to have been the richest human that ever lived. They estimate he might have been worth as much as 400 billion in today's money. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a massive achievement for Africa, because one person being rich and being a king sort of probably implies some form of oppression, usually. But as far as kings go, Mansa Musa was said to have been a fairly decent king who gave away a lot of money, gold, to poor people, particularly on his pilgrimage to Mecca. He gave away so much gold in Egypt that it took 10 years for the price of gold to return to normal. That's how much gold he gave away in Egypt. And part of the mythology about Timbuktu and about this wealthy black kingdom was a result of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca and all of the rumors that spread around the world, and particularly around Europe at the time, that was going through the plague and the Dark Ages and all kind of other madness, while Mali was fairly rich. They heard about this African king down there past where the Moroccans live. We need to go and find that guy because he's getting some money. Now, the gentleman on the right was the ruler of the Moors. Why have I picked this particular image? Because the way that history has been racialized, even in the modern world, for those who don't know, by the way, Spain was a Muslim country for 800 years. So African and Arab Muslims colonized Spain in 711 AD until 1492, the year Columbus set sail. For 800 years, Spain was a Muslim country. No one thinks to teach us that in school. But because there was forms of race-based slavery in the Islamic world, some of the scholars have deliberately kind of distorted the history and said the only role of black people in the Islamic world, full stop, and even in Moorish Spain, was as servants and slaves, and that same history has come into play in that world, even though we know, because we have copious pictures, hundreds of pictures, I've just shown you Saint Maurice, which also means more, of rulers, of people in every position, clearly depicted as black. One only has to read Shakespeare as a fellow, and it becomes very clear that who Shakespeare had in mind when he was describing Moorish people. We know that there were 4 main dynasties in Spain, and two of the major dynasties, the Almoravid and the Almohad, were what we call Berbers. If you go to Africa today, you'll see that there are Berbers that are all kinds of mixes. The Tuareg people, for example, some of the blackest people in Africa are Berbers, as are much of the population of Morocco. So even that history has been deliberately distorted to paint away some of the role of black African people in the Islamic world. Next slide, please. Now this is the most contentious and controversial part of the lecture, and this is the part where I think there's some room to have some fun and for us to contemplate things that are considered outrageous. A scholar called Ivan van Sertima wrote 2 books, one called They Came Before Columbus and one called Early America Revisited. And both of these books, but particularly the first one, received a lot of criticism and a lot of praise. It was a very polarizing work because he suggested that Africans sailed to America before Christopher Columbus. Now I've read a lot of the critiques of his work, and I'll be honest with you, most of the critiques I've read to this point, and I'd be happy to see a better one, have either just lied about what he said. They've said that he said all the Olmecs were Africans. He never said that. They've said that he said Africans civilized Native Americans. Who would say such a racist, idiotic thing other than a racist idiot? He never said that. He never said that Africans founded Olmec civilization. These are all things that people said he said, and even put in quotation marks in their articles, because they knew people were not going to read Van Sertima's work. Once you labeled him a crazy Afrocentric black person, even though he's half Native American, didn't matter, job done. People.
Ignorance builds fear. That's why they're lying.
We're not going to read his work. Then some other critiques that I've read around his work just deal with partial pieces of the evidence in isolation and say, see, therefore he's wrong. But if you view one piece of evidence in a case in isolation, you're not building a whole case. So I'm happy to see a better, more rounded critique, but until then, I'm going to present to you some of the evidence he presents in his book. You can decide for yourself, based on the evidence in his books, if you think the position that he's put forward is rational and sensible, not based on our bias and the ridiculous idea that Africans couldn't have sailed across the ocean, but based on actual evidence. So some of the evidence he put together, shocking as it may seem, were 13 different European witnesses, including Columbus and Columbus's son. The names are all up there, you can go and check the book, check his references, who talked about seeing Africans when they got to America. Columbus particularly doesn't talk about actually seeing them himself. He talks about the indigenous people of Haiti giving him some spears that they said they traded with black people that came from the southeast. He takes them back to Spain. They're examined by the Spanish metallurgist, who concludes they were the same as the spears they were trading with Guinea. One of these scholars here, the Frenchman, Captain Calhert, explicitly refers to the Africans he saw in Panama as Mandingos, which were the people of medieval Mali. So 13 different Europeans. African oral tradition in the Malian kingdom says that King Abubakari II left, he abdicated the throne with 200 ships to sail to the great continent to the west. There are 2 contemporary Arabic documents from Egypt that tell the same story of King Abubakari II abdicating the throne and sailing to the great continent to the west. None of this conclusive yet. But here's where it gets really sticky. The Smithsonian Institute found 2 skeletons that they concluded, based on anthropological examination, to be African tropically adapted skeletons at Hull Bay in St. Thomas, dated from 1250 AD. Gets a bit problematic. On an island just close to that, they found an ancient African writing system, which I'm about to show you, called the Tifinagh script, which originates in Libya, but was also used by medieval Malians. Modern voyages on ancient crafts, so 3 different European scholars rebuilt, first of all, ancient Egyptian ships, then medieval African ships, and then one guy even sailed, the last guy in that list, Alan Lombard, sailed across the Atlantic in a raft with no supplies, just a fishing rod, and he caught rainwater. So the Atlantic is not particularly hard to cross. We know that Columbus was sailing down the coast of Africa trying to get to India, and he got caught in these currents. To assume that it's impossible for an African fisherman to have made the same mistake, let alone a royal fleet of 200 ships, seems a bit strange to me. I don't know why we would assume that. And then things got even more controversial. In 1992, the female scientists who developed the test to test hair for drugs, so that test that people still use. If you're a football player, or if you're an athlete, or if you're a prison person, they want to see if you're a prisoner and they want to see if you've been taking drugs, they examine the proteins in your hair and they can see what kind of drugs you've been taking. The woman who developed that test in 1992 found cocaine in the stomach of Ramesses II. And she was so shocked by what she found, because she knows that cocaine comes from America, she tested and retested and retested because she knew she was going to get loads of stick. Then she tested Sudanese mummies and found the same thing, and read what she said. She got hate mail, people cussing her, people were just like, what are you talking about, you're an idiot. A woman whose scientific prowess is there, is there to be attested to, but what she discovered was so upsetting for some people that she was hated on by people who, of course, are nowhere near as scientifically qualified as she is. Botany and oceanography and ceremonial and cultural correspondences between some of the stuff we're seeing in Africa and in the Americas. For example, Bart Jordan, a famous mathematical genius, child genius, who was so bright that he was given a public audience with Albert Einstein when he was just a child. This is how mathematically genius the gentleman was. He'd done a study of African pyramids, of ancient Egyptian pyramids, and Mesoamerican pyramids. According to him, not according to me, I'm not on that level mathematically. According to his study, he's like, they have to have been related, because the complex mathematical relationships to particular planets like Venus that these pyramids are built around, there's just no way. He was like, it's impossible that you would get that correlation without some sort of relationship. Again, if you have an issue with it, take it up with him.
And people say, oh, Africans are not that clever. Oh, Africans, they're dumb or something like that. But we built the pyramids, we built the Great Zimbabwe. We were the richest people on the planet. I mean, we're building stuff. We're building them like 5-story buildings. 5-story buildings. No one had that anywhere. No one had that anywhere. And people are still hating.
I don't have the answer, but next slide. So, here we have in Mexico, in 800 BC, cane rows. No big deal, till we turn the face round. How do we explain a face like that turning up in Mexico in 800 BC? Now, I would put it to you that if this was an overtly Chinese face, or a face that looked like a Viking, we wouldn't even have to have a debate. Everyone would be like, well, it must mean based on one face. The Vikings must have gone to America. How could you have an obviously Viking face in America unless there was Vikings there? Yet we can have a face like this, and people can honestly look at this and say, it's impossible that people of African heritage could have gone to America. Okay, and not all the Olmec heads look like that. I want to restate again, Van Sertima was very clear. Not all of the Olmec heads were Africans. So pointing out that some of them don't look like Africans is irrelevant, because he was very clear that many of them are obviously not African and native.
And again, if you're saying that, remember, we had boats.
American. Next slide, please.
That was so hard to get.
This is the Tifinagh script that I was talking about from Hull Bay in St. Thomas. Sorry, the Tifinagh script is not in Hull Bay. It's on, does say there, Bottom Reef Bay in St. John's in the US Virgin Islands. So same collection of islands. And if you read what it says, it actually talks about ablutions. So not only is it an ancient Libyan script that we know medieval Malians used, but it makes an explicit Islamic reference. And we know that kingdom was Islamic at the time. Next slide, please. This is Mali at its height. I just wanted to show you to get a sense of just how massive it was. 1,500 miles across. And again, according to even mainstream historiography, it's now accepted that this was probably the richest state in the 14th century world. So to suggest that the richest state in the 14th century world wasn't capable of building ships and sailing the ocean seems a little odd to me. Again, I'm not saying you have to accept all of this evidence. I'm saying all I want as a counter-argument is evidence. I don't want prejudice and bias, which is what I've seen from a lot of the scholars that have counteracted Van Sertima. These carvings are from Panama and Mexico, from the 1300s. The member of the German royal family called Professor von Hottenau, who helped Van Sertima write the book, has over 100 of these carvings. They were tested by a process called thermoluminescence, which I don't scientifically understand, but apparently it's a way you date museum artifacts. Before the German museum would buy them, of course they wanted to know they were not forgeries, because some people even said, he forged them all these carvings. And then they were tested before the German museum would buy them, and they were originally owned by a member of the German royal family. How do we explain carvings like this turning up in Mexico in the 1300s? And again, and again, and again, this is my favorite one. That is a handsome face, that one, isn't it? Let's be honest. If someone's got a more logical explanation than that people that look like this were present in Mexico, I'd love to hear it. And this is the reconstruction of an ancient Egyptian papyrus ship done by Thor Heiderhau, a Norwegian, in 1969, he went to Chad. He didn't go to Egypt, he went to Chad. And the Budumu boatmen in Lake Chad rebuilt him an ancient Egyptian papyrus ship, and he sailed from Egypt to Barbados. So we know it was physically possible. So again, we've got to digest the evidence and decide what we think based on the evidence. Until then, I'm going to agree with the American head of the Smithsonian Institute that was part of the archaeological team. In fact, he was the head of the archaeological team that digged up the Olmec heads. He said the following, and I will read it word for word. He said, Van Sertima's work is a summary of 6 or 7 years of meticulous research based upon archaeology, Egyptology, African history, oceanography, geology, astronomy, botany, rare Arabic and Chinese manuscripts, letters and journals of early American explorers, and observations of physical anthropologists. As one who has been immersed in Mexican archaeology for some 40 years and participated in the excavation of the first giant heads, I must confess I am firmly convinced of the soundness of Van Sertima's conclusions. But people would sell it to you that the only people who believe in Van Sertima are crazy Afrocentric black people trying to make themselves feel better for racism.
Hating again.
Slide, please. And this is the final part of my conversation with you today, because the one part of African history we do teach is, or as I prefer to call it, the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans. And usually when we teach that history, if there's anything you take away from it, growing up in the UK, it's that William Wilberforce set Africans free. There's nothing else you probably learned in school other than William Wilberforce set Africans free. I went to the National Portrait Gallery when I was a child, 7 years old, and my teacher pulled me aside and pointed at the picture of William Wilberforce and said, Kingsley.
When I was in school, the only black history that I learnt from history was Rosa Parks, and I mean it's not bad. It's just that it's not bad. It's just that Rosa Parks is an American. She was an African American, and her history happened in America. I've never learnt about anything about black history in England. Do I even know any? Probably no. I don't think I know any history of black people in England.
She was Canadian. She was Canadian. This man, he stopped slavery. Now, unfortunately for my teacher, I went to a Pan-African Saturday school where we learned about the Maroons and the Haitian Revolution. So I'm 7, but I know a little history. So I'm like, Miss, all by himself. You mean he helped? And she beefed me. She was like, no, Kingsley, he stopped slavery. I was like, come on, let's stop it. So, for people who believe in freedom and democracy, as we say we do, who believe in human rights, we must understand that slavery is not new. Even though the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans may have been particularly brutal, may have gone on particularly long, may have been particularly large scale, there may have been particular features. Ancient Greece had slavery, ancient Rome had slavery, there was slavery in the Middle East, there was forced servitude in certain African empires for sure, right? Slavery is not a new thing in human history, but only once in the whole history of humanity that I know of, and that I've ever been able to find in history, have enslaved people overthrown the government and become the government themselves. Now surely for anyone who genuinely believes in freedom and democracy and human rights, and we talk about the march toward democracy, what could be more democratic than getting rid of slavery? We want to cheer for abolitionists, but we won't cheer for enslaved people who freed themselves and became the government. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, between 1789 and 1804 in Haiti, the enslaved Africans in Haiti defeated the 3 major European empires of the time at war and declared themselves independent and the first nation to abolish slavery. I know our Prime Minister wants to keep repeating while he's visiting Jamaica that everyone in Jamaica should remember Britain's role in abolition because Britain was the first country to abolish slavery. But 1804 comes before 1807. It's just basic arithmetic. Next slide, please. Some of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution, again, one of the fascinating things about history is how sexist history is, even revolutionary history. So most of the leaders we know, even from black revolutionary history, are always men. Yet we know in the Haitian Revolution, from Toussaint Louverture's own mouth, a gentleman we're going to get to in a minute, that 30% of all the fighting troops in the Haitian Revolutionary Army were women. Given that 2/3 of the people enslaved in the Americas were men, that means women were absolutely fully playing their role in the army. This is one of the leaders, Cecile Fatiman. She was what we call a voodoo priest, and her and a man called Dutty Bookman, who was also a voodoo priest and a Muslim. He was a former Maroon in Jamaica. He left Jamaica, he came to Haiti. In 1789, they staged a ceremony that was really what we see as the formal part of the Haitian Revolution. We have to understand there were hundreds of rebellions throughout transatlantic slavery, which is normal. You try to kidnap people and their children and enslave them, they're going to rebel. It's normal. And the only way to maintain slavery was through terrorism. And we can go through whole catalogues of the kinds of terrorism that we used. But in 1789, Bookman and Fatiman started a ceremony that kicked off what would become the only successful slave revolution in human history and lead to the defeat of the three major empires in Europe and the breaking of the back of the transatlantic traffic forever. Next slide, please. Another leader, female leader, Santi Bellaire. She's famous because when she was executed, which she was, she first of all demanded to be executed by firing squad. They were going to hang her because she was a woman. She said, no, I demand to be executed by firing squad like a man. And according to the tradition, her husband, naturally, if you're about to be killed, was a bit upset and he was crying. And she apparently slapped him and said, do you not know how sweet it is to die for liberty? Stand up. And basically her husband had to stand up and take the bullets like a man. Because we're told only men can be brave. Be like a man, don't be like a woman. Well, Santi Bellaire was like a man. Of course, she was really like a woman. Next slide, please. Now, the leaders that we do know, if we know anything about the Haitian Revolution, will be the following two gentlemen. This gentleman is called Jean-Jacques Dessalin. He was the man who actually led the country to independence. He was the deputy general, if you like, for most of the revolution. He was underneath the main leader, Toussaint Louverture. But he was the leader who actually took Haiti across the finish line, who fought the final battle against the French, the Battle of Vertier. And he declared the country independent in 1804. After declaring the country independent, he massacred all of the French people left on the island. What a lot of pseudo-historians have done is said he killed all the white people left on the island to try and racialize the history in a way that is not totally accurate. What they don't really want to tell you is, no, he killed all of the French people left on the island, with the active encouragement of Britain and America, who were not really getting on with France at the time. This is during the Napoleonic Wars. What's more, part of this history that we don't learn, fascinating part of the history, is that the Polish, who were part of the French army, defected from the French army and fought with the Africans against the French, against slavery. And when the revolution was over, he didn't kill the Polish. In fact, if you look at the Constitution of 1805, he done something that's very fascinating. He declared that the only ethnic identity valid in Haiti from this day forward would be black. And that even the Polish and the Germans who fought with us, from this day forward, they're black. Which I thought was fascinating as a social scientist, for someone to say, right, being black has been a badge of dishonor, has been a crime, has been something to make you a slave for all of our history on this island. Now blackness is just going to be normal. We're even going to say that white people are black. And interestingly, of course, they renamed the island Haiti after the honor of the indigenous people, because that was their name for it. Yeah, the French had called it, or the Spanish had called it San Domingo, and it had all various different European names. It's now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, by the way, because it's one island. But during colonial times, it was at various points, one side was Spanish, one side was French, then it was unified, then it split again. And this is the gentleman that everyone knows, if they do know about the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture. He was the leader for most of the revolution. All of these people I've just shown you began their life as enslaved human beings. Toussaint Louverture was a slave until he was 45 years old. But he became an educated enslaved person. He became a privileged slave, if you like. He was allowed to read. He was a coachman, which was usually a role that was reserved for mulattoes, mixed people, or for Europeans. So he began to read. And in the Bible, and in a book by a French scholar called Abby Reinau, he started reading all sorts of stories about rebellion, about revolution, about a Messiah. And he decided he was going to be that Messiah. And he became a brilliant military general, and he led the country for most of its history. Then in 1802, after the French had betrayed him many, many times, the French said, all right, come to France, come on, we'll settle this. Come to France, we'll have a negotiation. Many of Toussaint's advisors said, Toussaint, don't go to France. You know what they're going to do, don't go to France. But I think maybe Toussaint was tired at this point. Maybe he thought the French was going to negotiate, as they said they were going to. I don't know what he thought. But he went to France, the French put him in prison and starved him to death, because they intended to reinstall slavery, even though they said they hadn't.
Oh, you bastards. Oh my gosh. The French people that did that, bastards.
Fortunately for history, the French lost the final battle and slavery was outlawed in Haiti. But unfortunately, in 1825, once the different European warring powers had made up, the French threatened to re-invade Haiti. And they said, if you don't pay us back for our loss of earnings, for our loss of property, 91 million gold francs, we're going to go to war with you again. At that point, maybe Haiti wasn't in a position to go to war again. They paid back those 91 million gold francs, and it took over a century to do so. So when we talk about slavery being ancient history, well, if they started paying in 1825, I do believe it was 1947 when they finished paying that debt. Next slide, please. But one of the things that the Haitian Revolution did lead to was the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon, for those who don't know what that was, that green area was French Louisiana. That area of America was owned by the French until 1803. Napoleon had dreams of a new empire based on Haiti. Haiti at the time was the most profitable colony in the world, producing more sugar than India, producing half of all Europe's coffee. It was an incredibly profitable colony. Once Napoleon lost that colony, he had no purpose for this anymore, so he sold it to what became America. So the Haitian Revolution, and revolution on a tiny little island of enormous hemispheric importance, of enormous human importance, yet we don't learn about it. We've got to make up our mind. We're either for freedom and democracy, and we're going to celebrate movements for that, or we're not. We can't cheer for abolitionists, because their efforts would have been worthless, with the greatest of respect to them, without the revolutions that were going on in the Caribbean, and we can demonstrate that. 1804 Haitian Revolution ends, oh, magically, 1807. Britain has an epiphany and says slavery is bad, and outlaws the transatlantic traffic. Finally, slavery itself was made illegal in Britain in 1834, or in Britain's Caribbean colonies, 2.5 years after the largest rebellion in Jamaican history. Well, what do you know? Isn't that a coincidence that the dates are always so close? 60,000 enslaved Africans in Jamaica under a man called Sam Sharp burnt down half the plantations in Jamaica, killed a whole bunch of slave masters. 500 of them were hung in revenge, but nonetheless, slavery, the back of slavery in Jamaica, in Haiti and elsewhere had been broken. There was no use for it even anymore. And of course, it wasn't central in many ways to Britain and other more industrialized countries' economies at that point. But again, that's another debate for another day. That's not to say there were not genuine abolitionists in this country, and they shouldn't be remembered. They absolutely should. But to remember abolitionists without remembering hundreds of thousands of people who physically shed their blood to free themselves seems a little bit hypocritical to me. Next slide, please. The last slide I'm going to show you for the evening before I put up a bibliography and we open up. This is the Citadel. This is a military fortification that was built in Haiti within the 15 years after it declared itself independent. I think it's incredible that a group of people who began their lives as enslaved human beings were able, for a brief period until they were extorted again, to build monuments like this. Though I must be honest to history and not romanticize history, the guy who took over, Dessalin, the man I showed you, was assassinated, by the way. When the revolution ended, he made the mistake of kind of trying to institute some kind of socialist measures in Haiti. He said to the other elite black and mulatto leaders, he said, listen, we've got all this property now. We're rich now. We've inherited what the French used to have. I think we should redistribute this property to the people who won the revolution, to the poor people, to the enslaved. The other leaders were like, no thanks, and they murdered him. And the gentleman who took over was a bit of a despot. He may have been black, but he was a black despot. And so we know that many, many Haitians died building this. So I don't want to come here and be romantic and pretend that everything was all wonderful once the revolution was won, but I am putting this up to say that I do think it's incredible as part of the human story that a group of people who'd lived most of their lives as slaves were able to construct something like this, notwithstanding, of course, the brutality that underpinned it. Here's a very brief bibliography for some of the information that I put up tonight. We'll leave this up as we open up for questions. But again, I just want to provoke you with that food for thought and look at how can we fully understand the human story in this globalized world if we don't have any real sense of major parts of it? And especially in a country like this that is becoming increasingly multicultural, especially in the city I'm from, somewhere like London, can we really justify having a curriculum in the 21st century that teaches us more about Henry VIII killing his wives than it does about, say, for example, the Peterloo Massacre? Something probably many people in this room may not have even heard of. Yeah, the Peterloo Massacre, for those who don't know, because history is of course not distorted just along lines of race, as I've already pointed out, it's distorted along lines of gender, but also lines of class. The Peterloo Massacre was a massacre that occurred just outside of Manchester in 1819, where 15 unarmed protesters, protesting for basic parliamentary reform, were hacked to death in the UK. Do you not think that would be relevant for us to know? Because many of the freedoms that we have, the right to vote, we're almost taught like we just have it because the British elite are so benevolent that they've just always given people the right to vote. In reality, even within the UK, people had to shed their blood for the very limited freedoms that people have and maybe take for granted. And so for me, with all my biases, with all my political persuasions, I would advocate for a much more revolutionary, inclusive, people-centered, global teaching of history for the world that we live in. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to step it down. And, yeah, I'm going to see what the next part is about in the next video. If it's relevant, then I'm going to pause the video. And if it's not relevant, then you're going to know why there's no video about it. But it's quite interesting though. Like, I never knew about the Peterloo Massacre. Like, I had no idea about that. And it's not something that's really taught in UK. I feel like the UK hides its evil history. That's what I feel like. Like, no one really knows about the UK, like slavery, and the UK, like killing people. Like, they never teach that at school and stuff. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed, guys. And if I post another video, like last part of this, then it was relevant. But if I do not, then it's not relevant. Okay. There is a fly He looks like a dragonfly. He just flew in my room, and I've gotta go. Peace.